Today we're going to talk about the French Revolution and how it relates to Western Civ, which of course it does. The French Revolution, in many regards, people often tie it to the American Revolution, and it is. The American Revolution happens first, and in many ways is a kind of experiment of French Enlightenment and the teachings of the philosophes. Are you ready to go? Okay. And we've been talking about philosophes. If we take, for example, the idea of an American philosophe, most of them are French, I suppose I would talk about Ben Franklin perhaps as being much like an American philosophe. His sort of teaching, his idea of moral living, or at least living according to the things that he wrote, the way that he thought that what he was talking about was better than what others were talking about, and how we ought to live. And so I suppose it was a good idea to send Ben Franklin to France as an ambassador, as a liaison between the fledgling America and France to get help. So if we take a look at the reasons for the French Revolution, why did it take place? Obviously all those things we've been talking about, the Enlightenment thinking, the teaching of the philosophes, is certainly there. And I think also, in direct and indirect ways, the American Revolution leads to the French Revolution. In, I suppose, indirect ways, the French Revolution becomes an experiment. An experiment of how these ideas might actually work. I think the philosophes, I don't know if they were surprised or not, that their ideas were actually put into action and they actually worked. I don't know if you've ever had ideas like that. You know, you think about something, promote something, and then you actually see it happen, and wow, it actually worked. Well, it did. And then I suppose in a more direct way, since France was involved in the American Revolution, by the way, they were on our side. A lot of people are sort of anti-French, I've found over the years. They don't like the French for some reason. They want their freedom fries. They don't want their French fries. That kind of thing. But the French, have helped us. Well, we've helped them too, over a long period. And because of that, because the French did help us, now, why did they help us? Because they don't like the British, primarily. Let's be honest. The French and the British have never really gotten along. And if we were giving trouble to the British, well, then the French say, hey, let's help them out. There is a principle that you can observe in history that I think is a true one, and that is, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Can I get you to take these things off? Yeah, thanks. My enemy's enemy is my friend. That's a principle that works down through history, if you think about it. Sometimes people are surprised by, this country or this person helping this person when they don't really seem to have much in common. But in the end, you take a look, they have a common enemy. Now, if you have siblings, you understand this. Multiple siblings. Sometimes siblings, I'm sure not in your family because that kind of thing wouldn't happen. But in some families, from what I understand, sometimes siblings will kind of gang up on another sibling. But those allegiances can change. Right? The two younger ones against the older one, the two boys against the girl, the two girls against the boy, whatever. And those things can kind of move around. But if you want to understand down through history why, some people are very surprised when you tell them, for example, that the United States at one time aided Osama bin Laden. We gave him weapons. We gave him training. Why would we do such a thing? Because he was fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. Our enemy at the time in the Cold War, Soviet Union, he was fighting the Soviet Union. Okay, we'll help you fight him. So, the French, I don't think the French had any animosity towards us, but let's be honest, part of the reason that they're doing this is because it's going to be bad for the British. But when they did that, they spent an awful lot of money. And that is what's going to cause the French king to need more money, and that, sort of in a direct way, will lead him to call to get more money, and that's sort of the thing that tips everything over and gives us the French Revolution beginning. Now, another reason for the French Revolution would be the fact that things are changing in French society, the economy and the society, and really, we're not keeping up on that if we are French. For example, let me give you an example. Nobility in France, like nobility about everywhere, doesn't work. If they think that whatever that is going to be could be considered work, they don't do it. Why? Because we're nobility. Nobility does not work. Work is what peasants do. I don't work. I'm nobility. So they don't go out and plow fields. They don't go out and harvest grain or whatever. Likewise, they consider business work, selling things and managing things. So they don't get involved in business either, because that is beneath them. So what you have then are peasants who begin to make quite a bit of money in business, but they have no political power because they're peasants. In this case, now they're wealthy peasants, right? So you've got wealthy peasants, you got peasants, you got wealthy peasants, and you got nobility. In fact, in some cases, the wealthy peasants are loaning money to the nobility. When some of the nobility get into trouble, well, where are they going to go get their money? Well, we'll go borrow it from that guy. And so, it doesn't take too long for the wealthy peasants to begin to see, you know what? We do not have the influence that we ought to have given what we're doing. The nobility has all this influence, and we're the ones that's really running the economy. We're the ones that are loaning them money and so forth. And so that had not changed. So we start to see maybe what we could call a middle class. And they had different concerns than the nobility, and they had different concerns than the peasants, the poor peasants. What did they want? They wanted power, political power, so forth. They also wanted an efficient government that would not mess up their business. Governments can be pretty good about messing up business with lots of regulations and lots of, things that, let's say you have a business and you want to do something, expand or whatever, and then you hit, boom, here's a giant book of regulations, and here's, you're going to have to pay this and do this and build it like this, and you can't hire this kind of person, all kinds of regulations. And so they want a sort of efficient government that won't get in the way of their business, and they want some power. So the nobility wanted to keep their power and even expand it. The middle class wants to expand their political power, wants an efficient government. Then in peasants, you could divide them into urban peasants and what I might call rural peasants. Urban peasants are mostly people who are working in different trades. People that are, baking bread and maybe a blacksmith, things like that. People that are doing physical labor, but they're not planting crops. Their main concern is that they have a secure food supply. Because guess what? If you live in a big city like Paris, a couple of million people, let's say, and you are not raising your own, food, then you're going to be worried about that. Because sometimes what happens is, given the upheaval that's going on, the food supply gets delayed or broken. So the food that's raised out in the countryside is not making it into the cities so that the bread can be baked and so on and so forth. And so people begin to get hungry. Now the people who are out in the countryside, of course, they're doing the agricultural work. They're not as worried about a secure food supply because they're raising the food. They can usually get a little something to eat, have a garden, have a chicken, maybe, some eggs, whatever, some vegetables. But what they're worried about, of course, is they have very heavy taxes on them, and the land that they can farm is very limited because they don't own the land. So land ownership, land access, taxes, and these taxes are all tied to the past. They're all tied to the nobility who have owned all the land, and then it used to be you would do your stuff in service, like you would go out and farm and then you would give them a percentage. But what that had kind of changed over into was monetary taxes, money. All right, so we have different groups that have different desires, different interests. And part of the problem here, of course, is that the French government, the king, has, at this point, absolute power. So, his name is Louis the 16th. The kings have had a long period of power. But if the king wanted, pretty much he had absolute power, but there was one restriction. If the king wanted to raise taxes, he had to call a meeting that was known as the Estates General. The Estates General. Now, to understand this, you have to remember that society was then divided into three estates, or three groups. All right? Nobility, clergy, nobility, and peasants. Yes?
Did he reign for those years, or did he rule his life for those years?
Well, both. He was alive while he was reigning.
But is it like when he was born and when he died, or not?
No, this is when he reigns. Yeah, when he reigns. So we see then that he would have to call this meeting and get them all together, and they're going to vote in order. That is, the first estate votes first, the second estate second, the third estate third. Well, guess what? The clergy is the first estate, the nobility is the second estate, and the peasants are the third estate. Now, if you want to divide this up percentage-wise of population, about 90% of the people would fall into that third estate. That is, peasants. Okay? Just using rough numbers, about 90. And that means that less than 10% are of the top two estates. So what does that mean? That would be, let's say, for example, here's a family, a mother, a father, and they got 12 kids. And they decide, we're going to decide how to do things. So we're going to have a family meeting. Father gets a vote, mother gets a vote, all the kids combined get a vote. Guess what? If the mother and the father agree, the kids never get, really their vote doesn't mean anything, right? Because the mother and father say, yeah, well, we're not going to Disney World this weekend. And the kids say, we all want to go to Disney World this weekend or whatever. And so it doesn't happen. That's pretty much the way this was. If the nobility and the clergy could agree, they didn't even need to consult the peasants. That was just kind of a formality. And so that's what they did. They wanted to vote in order. And traditionally they did vote in order. And the king didn't even like calling this because he pretty much just wanted to do what he wanted. But this was a stipulation. So for the first time in many years, he calls this Estates General. And when this happens, the people of the third estate, the peasants, especially those rich peasants, those business people doing business, they vote in representatives of each estate to go to the meeting. So it's not like a mass meeting of millions of people. There's a representative vote here. And so the representatives of the peasants are all these wealthy peasants. And guess what? They don't like this arrangement that the clergy and the nobility each get a vote and we collectively get a vote. Because, by the way, the clergy is controlled by the nobility. The bishops and all those things, they're all from noble families. So they call for the idea that the third estate would want to vote by the number. That is, they should get more votes than one. Why? Because let's say they got 90% of the people. So in fact, we should get 90% of the vote. Yeah, sort of democracy in action, right? So we should get 9 votes and you guys get 1, or we should get, we should get 5 votes and you guys get 2, something like that. So in other words, we would decide. The king's not going to go for that. So what does the king do? He says, you know what? We don't really need you guys here anyway. All I really need to do is get the clergy and the nobility to agree to this. We'll negotiate it between us. You guys are kicked out of the meeting. Troublemakers. Right? So they are. These representatives are kicked out of the meeting, but they decide they're not going to disband. They're on the estate of the palace, and on that estate there was a tennis court. Now I don't want you to think of an outdoor tennis court, kind of like we have over here on our campus, right? But this is an indoor tennis court. That is, it has a roof over it and walls and everything. So that's open, and they get in there, and they all gather in this big room. And they say, you know what? We are not going to disband because we are really France. Those guys are not France. We represent France. They don't represent France. You see how this is starting to go? We represent like 90% of the people or more. So therefore, we are France. Now, the King of France has been saying for a long time that he was France. I am the state. The estate is me. Now they're saying we are the state. We are France. And so they refuse to disband, and they take an oath that says, we're not going to give up. We're going to make changes. We're going to get a new constitution. We're going to do all these things. And they claim that they are the legitimate rulers. They are the legitimate rulers. And so they take an oath. It's called the tennis court oath. Tennis court oath. In July of 1789. So this is the beginning of the French Revolution. So here is a painting that shows this tennis court. It shows all these representatives in the tennis court here taking this oath. You can see it looks like an unruly mob. There's even a balcony up there. That's for people to be able to watch the tennis match, I guess, from up high. You see the windows are open. The wind is blowing. They took this oath. They said, we are forming a national assembly. We are the legitimate government of France. And they later write a constitution. Now, news of this makes its way to the peasants in Paris, who, by the way, had been having a shortage of food. Rumors were out that at this meeting the peasants had gathered and they had sort of rebelled, and that the king was upset. And the idea here was that the king was going to send his troops to put down the peasants. At least that was the rumor. And so in Paris, the peasants in Paris begin to think that maybe the king's troops are coming to get them, which at this point they really were not. And so they begin to rebel. Thing is, they don't have any weapons. They don't have any weapons to defend themselves from the king's troops. This is in part, I can tell you, since yesterday was Constitution Day, all right, why in our Constitution we have very clearly defined the right that all citizens can bear arms. What is that for? Some people say it's to defend yourself from criminals. It's really, to be honest, it's put there to defend yourself from the government. Nobody likes to say that. That would be considered to be even worse. But the idea here is that if you have a completely unarmed population, the government can do whatever they want. All they got to do is send their troops. And people have no way to defend themselves. And it's because of this kind of thing that I think that language is in our Constitution. Well, you can debate that elsewhere. But these guys have no weapons. It was really not allowed to have weapons. Only the army could have weapons. So they heard that there were weapons in a place called the Bastille. Here is a drawing of the Bastille. By the way, if you ever go to Paris and some guy wants to take you on a tour of the Bastille, what are you going to do? Going to go? I mean, it might be nice to see it. Do not go. The Bastille was torn apart by the people with their bare hands. Okay? So, there is no Bastille. But on July 15, 1789, the peasants of Paris stormed the Bastille. So this becomes sort of like France's July 4th, 4th of July, the 15th of July, right? Sort of their Independence Day. They call it Bastille Day. They don't call it Independence Day. But that's kind of what it is. It's a remembrance of this is the time when they rose up against the tyrant of the king and so forth and became more democratic. They thought there were weapons in there. This thing had been used as a kind of fortress at one time. It had later been used as a prison. It had also been used as a military barracks at one time. So when they storm it and they do get inside, they find, they had heard there were a bunch of weapons stored in there. They didn't really find any weapons in there. However, this event saves the National Assembly because this gets the king worried that if he goes in and just, rounds up all these guys that are on that tennis court or whatever and arrests them all or executes them or whatever, that he's got bigger problems than just this group of, I don't know how many there were, 300 people. He's going to have to still deal with all these other people. And so the Bastille, the storming of the Bastille and the formation of the National Assembly, the tennis court oath, are merged together as a symbol that the peasants are rebelling. And when the peasants out in the countryside hear that the peasants are revolting, you know what they do? They decide to revolt. They go after the guy who owns the estate, however. Because guess what? The guy who owns the estate out in the countryside lives in this big sort of mansion and owns all the land, they go and attack him. Again, they don't have weapons, so they're taking pitchforks and sickles and whatever they have. You got a question?
So the peasants were the ones that rebelled, and then they're the symbol that you're talking about?
Well, I think Bastille, the storming of the Bastille is a symbol, but it gets kind of tied with this formation of a National Assembly. Everybody begins to hear about it. Things have happened. The peasants have kind of rebelled against the king formally, I guess you might say, legislatively, but then physically in Paris. And so now out in the countryside, there's so much tension that the people, peasants out there begin to revolt. And they go after these rich guys who own all the land, the nobility. And they destroy records. Why would they destroy records that he has at his estate, his house? I'm not talking like, vinyl records. You guys have seen a few of those, I guess. They're kind of popular again. But I'm just talking about records, kind of like lists of things.
To restore everything again?
Yeah, they want to change the way it is, right? Because those records show, for example, that I've got to pay him this much every year. And that he owns everything and that I don't. And that I must pay him every year annually because of all these records. If I burn those records, well, they can no longer be used as evidence. Let's say, for example, if you could suddenly wipe out all records of Mr. Visa, Mr. MasterCard, Mr. Student Loan, and all of those records were gone. All these guys will say, hey, you owe me this, this, and this, and you say, hey, prove it. And boom, I erased them all. And they're like, well, we know you owed us money. We can't find the records. Oh, too bad, you know. By the way, it won't work, you know, because they got all kinds of copies of it. All over the place. In the cloud. It's not in the cloud. It's on a hard drive, maybe inside a mountain somewhere. You know, that's where they keep a lot of this stuff. Keep the temperature cool. Well, anyway. It's a good idea, I suppose, but it's probably not going to work. But imagine if you could. Be a lot of people interested. If I said, hey, follow me, let's go destroy those records, I could probably get quite a few people to say, I'm interested in that. What do we got to do? Because suddenly, you are free of all that. You know, but I got a way to solve your problems. You know, if you have like credit card problems, which I hope you don't, all you got to do is do what I do. When you get the Visa bill, I pay it with the MasterCard. And when I get the MasterCard bill, I just pay it with the Visa. Everybody's happy. And I never have to actually pay. I just charge it. Well, give it a try. Well, then again, maybe not. So on August the 4th, the National Assembly abolishes serfdom. This is going to win them a lot of points with the peasants out in the countryside, because remember I told you that serfdom was something that the nobility had and they were still using, and that meant that an individual was tied to a piece of land. I mean, it's just slightly different than slavery. They abolished it. That's going to make them a lot of friends with a whole lot of people who are serfs and other people that are worried that they might become serf or whatever. So, and it just showed where they were going with this. So this is all happening quickly. Middle of July, 1789, August 4th, 1789. On August the 26th of 1789, they issue a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It's kind of like, a little bit like our Bill of Rights. Hopefully you know what that is. United States Bill of Rights, right? It's sort of their Bill of Rights. That is, that people have certain freedoms. That we have the freedom of speech. Freedom of speech. You can say, you're supposed to be able to say what's on your mind. There's a lot of places in this world today where you cannot. You couldn't go on television at night and ridicule the president of that country. Because if you did, you would not be around the next day. See what I'm saying? You'd be in prison, or you'd be dead, or something. You certainly would not be on television anymore. That's freedom of speech. Freedom of the press. Now, of course, the press has changed for us dramatically because the printed page is no longer where people get most of their information. However, you get the idea that you should have a free press, a press that's not just, say, owned by the government or not owned by, a special interest, but a press that will fairly report what's going on. Now, some people question how free our press is anymore. Well, that's a whole other debate. But here is the idea that we should be able to have a source of information that's not controlled. I go to the Middle East quite a bit, and when you go to the Middle East and you, say, pick up a newspaper or look at a website from a newspaper, you're not always sure what you're reading. What you're reading has been okayed by the Office of Information or whatever from that country. So you kind of wonder if you're getting the whole story. But here we're saying freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble. You probably don't think anything about that. Hey, let's meet, somewhere here on campus, at the Prado, somewhere. Let's meet at the wherever, Portico, and we're going to talk about the things that we think should be changed. In many countries, you are not free to do that. You cannot assemble. People cannot just assemble and talk about how things are going to change or protest things or do all that kind of stuff. That's not a freedom every country has, even today. And they didn't have it at France at this time. You say, now you will. Freedom of speech, press, and assembly. Freedom from arbitrary arrest. If you're to be arrested, there are certain procedures that have to be followed. There have to be charges against you. Those charges that can then be questioned. In other words, I shouldn't be able to say, you know what? You just kind of look suspicious to me. I don't like the way you look. I'm arresting you. I'm hauling you in. Locking you up. Before this, in France, they could. And the right to own property, which, again, we take that for granted. We got our stuff. That's my stuff. It's not your stuff. Keep your hands off of my stuff. I got my property. You got your property. Private property. This is private. This is my house. This is my yard. This is my car. We're used to that kind of thing, but that wasn't always the case. For example, the nobility owned all the countryside. Not only that, they owned all the animals. You might say, well, there's a rabbit out there. I'm hungry. I'm gonna get that rabbit and make some rabbit stew. Sorry, that's against the law. Why? The lord of the manor, guy that owns the land, he owns all the animals on the land. The birds, the rabbits, the deer, whatever it is that you might think you're going to eat. He's going to say, no, you don't. And if you do, you get in big trouble. In fact, you couldn't even grind your own wheat into flour to make bread, because that was controlled by the guy who owned the mill, who was also the guy who owned the fields, who was also the guy who owned everything around out there. All right, you get the idea. Now, what happens is, with all this upheaval, uprising, when people are fighting and having uprising, they don't go about their everyday business, all right? So guys who live out in the farms, they don't necessarily go out and plow the fields. They don't necessarily do the harvest. They don't necessarily do all the things they're supposed to do every day. Why? Because they're out killing nobility and burning records and, getting them in upheaval. So what does that mean? The food supply is terrible going into Paris. And so the women of Paris decide that they're going to do something. Because the women of Paris are the ones, primarily in Paris at this time, who saw to it that their family was fed. Their children. There's no bread. There's no food. They get angry. They're worried, obviously. So what do? They begin a march. They march out to Versailles. Why are they marching to Versailles? Versailles is a palace that's about, let's say roughly 20 miles from Paris. Give or take a mile or two. And that's where the king spent most of his time. He didn't want to live in Paris. It was too smelly, dirty, too many people yelling and too much stuff. I go out here on my nice palace at Versailles. If you ever get a chance to go visit the palace at Versailles, you can do it when you go to Paris. You can get on a train and you can ride out there. And you can take a tour and go around and see it. It's amazing. Palace. Gold leaf, gold chandeliers. Huge gardens with fountains and flowers. And, it's just unbelievable wealth. Palace at Versailles. That's why the king liked to be there. And he'd have big parties out there. And he would invite people. And that's sort of how he got things done that he wanted to get done. Anyway, he didn't want to be in Paris with all this trouble. He's out there at Versailles. So these ladies said, you know what? The king is out there at Versailles basically not doing his job. The king's job is to make sure things run right. At this point, they're not wanting to get rid of the king. No. They want the king to do his job. What they thought his job was, which was running France, right? And part of running France is making sure that we got food. We can go buy a loaf of bread or whatever. And so these ladies begin to march out. And they march out there, and here's a drawing of it. Look what they have. They got spears, axes. They even found a cannon somewhere. I like that in this drawing. And they're going out there, and they demand that the king hear them. So the king has to, kind of go out on a balcony and hear what they got to say. And basically they demand that the king come to Paris. That's their demand. He had a palace in Paris. You come to that palace, and you go there, and you make sure this stuff happens. That's pretty much was their demands. And guess what? That's pretty much what the king did. He did go into Paris, and he was, in part, sort of held captive, if you will. I mean, because the people wanted him to do his job. The women wanted him to do his job. So you can see there's a lot of anger here. There's a lot of fear. Maybe a lot of desperation. So, the National Assembly now is sort of taking charge of passing laws, decrees. Guess what they don't have? Money. They don't have any money. How do governments get money? What's that? Taxes. Boy, you got that one pretty fast. That's true. Governments only get money one way. They take it from the people that are in that country, and they appropriate it, and then they decide how it's spent. That's pretty much it. So, sometimes I hear people say, well, the government will pay for this, and the government will pay for that. And I'm thinking, well, government only gets money one way. So if the government's going to be paying billions of dollars more for this, that, and the other, they're going to have to take it from somewhere. It's going to have to be from us. So you got to keep that in mind. And so they needed money. How are they going to get the money? They're going to take church property. They thought this was the easiest thing that they could do. They're going to take the church property because you have to understand the Roman Catholic Church is the #1 owner of property in France at this time. #1. Why? How could that be? Well, the church never gives up land. Let's say some guy is on his deathbed. Maybe he hasn't done everything right in his life. He kind of wants a little, what I call fire insurance. SEU fire insurance. I mean a different kind of fire. Right? I mean, he wants to sort of make up for stuff he's done that's wrong. So he says, you know what? I'm going to donate some of my land to the church, some of my money, my property, and that's going to be a nice donation, and that's going to, help out. You know what some people say? People go out and sow their wild oats on Saturday night, and they come to church Sunday morning and pray for a crop failure. You ever heard that one? No? Never heard that one. Probably not. We don't talk about sin too much anymore. But anyway, if people are going out and doing wild stuff and then they don't really want anybody to find out about it, they kind of wake up in the morning and go, ooh, what did I do? I hope nobody finds out about that. If you find yourself feeling that way, well, you need to talk to somebody. I'm not saying me, but so I'm certainly no counselor. But if you find yourself waking up in the morning or looking in the mirror and saying, what have I done? Seek out some help. But people do sometimes put money in the offering plate, make a deal with God. Hey, God, I usually don't put any money in the plate or, like a couple bucks, but I'm gonna give you $100 today. Why? Because I did more than $100 worth of bad stuff this week. I'm going to try to even it out. Lord, you understand, right? Well, that's what people would do. They would make gifts, often land. And guess what? Once the church gets land, it keeps it. If I get land, let's say I had 1,000 acres. I don't. But let's say I had 1,000 acres of land. And I had 4 kids. Probably when I'm dead, it gets divided up between my kids, right? So my kids get 250 acres each. And then they each have 4 kids. And then it goes, divided by 4 again, 60 acres each. And so on until down you got no land at all. But it's just the opposite with the church. Once they get something, they don't ever get rid of it. They keep it forever. So over the years, hundreds and hundreds of years, the church had accumulated more land than anyone else in France. A lot of it through donations. Some of it through purchasing. It's that sort of leasing. And then what they do is they get this farmland and they lease it back to people who would farm it, or, they would use it in different ways to make money. So basically, the National Assembly said, you know what? We're going to take all the land of the church. We're going to own the church, is what they're saying. In fact, they take over the whole church. They don't just take the land. They take over the church. They take over the clergy. They pass a law in 1790 that says that all the clergy has to take an oath of loyalty to the French government. And that the French government are going to pay them their salary, not the church. That's what they do. What does that mean? You put money in the offering plate. That money used to go to the church and then they'd send some of it to Rome or whatever. That's not going to happen anymore. Any money you put in the offering plate is staying right here in France. If we don't like the way the clergy is being paid, if we don't want them to be able to say things that we don't want them to say that maybe might be negative, well, we're going to take care of that. We are now their boss. They got to sign this oath of loyalty, and if they don't follow it, they're out of a job. That's what they did. So I say they took the property, but in fact they took over the entire church. This was probably one of the most controversial things that they did, because there were a lot of peasants who were loyal to the church. There are a lot of peasants who maybe didn't really like the bishop or whatever, didn't really know him, but they kind of liked their local parish priest, because the local parish priest was the guy who did their weddings and baptized their children and so on, right? And so they kind of thought maybe he was a pretty good guy. Why are you giving him a hard time? So this was one of the most controversial things they did, but they completely took over the church. 1789. And by 1790, all the clergy had to take an oath of loyalty. They're going to use that money to back their currency. Paper currency really doesn't have any value. So we got a new constitution then, another one, in 1790. Everything's changing very rapidly. In this one, it officially creates a constitutional monarchy. Remember, still up to this point, they don't want to get rid of the king. But they want the king to not have absolute power like the previous kings had had. They want to control, they wanted to really have a king more like what they had in England, I guess. They probably wouldn't have put it quite that way. But they wanted a king, a monarchy that was limited and that was controlled by a constitution and by the trappings of the government. Another thing they did was divided people into passive and active citizens. That's kind of strange, right? Passive and active citizens. Now, first of all, I probably should say something here about citizenship. Here in the United States, we're very generous with citizenship, believe it or not. All you have to do to become a citizen is just be born here. That's a pretty low bar. In other words, your parents could be on vacation or being studying here in school or something, and you were born here, you're an American citizen. Neither one of your parents are American citizens. Matter of fact, they're just here temporarily or whatever. You're an American citizen. I can guarantee you that's not the way it is in many countries around the world today. You don't have citizenship for just being born there. Certainly didn't in France. Certainly at this time. People born in France were not automatically French citizens. So, how then do they divide it? So, for example, in France at this time, and in most countries at this time, the only people who could be citizens were men. And typically there was a wealth requirement. You had to have so much wealth. You had to be a landowner. If you didn't own any land, you were not a citizen. Several years ago, I went to Colonial Williamsburg. Anybody here ever been to Colonial Williamsburg? Long ways from here, maybe a couple of you. If you go to Colonial Williamsburg, they have a courthouse there. I went to the courthouse. I was outside the courthouse. They said they were going to have kind of a thing you could go in and see it. And they said, okay, we want all the men to stand over here and all the women and children over here. So I had the men stand there. Okay, we want all the men who own land. Anybody who doesn't own land, leave this group. Okay. Now we want everyone who's a member of a church. Active, like you're a member in a church. Leave. So we got it down to, there was only, I don't know, like 10 of us. I don't know. 15 of us, I don't know. Out of a crowd of 60 or so. They said, all right, let's go into church. You guys follow us. They put us up front in this courthouse. Everybody else seated out in the thing. And then they brought in charges. They used some of the people and had them read from cards, here are charges against people. It was kind of, they had active and passive citizens who would then be able to vote for representatives. So that meant only males. That meant only males that had the right level of wealth. And then those representatives would become members of the legislative assembly. Okay? So citizenship can be defined in different ways, not just the way maybe we think of it today. And by the way, still today, in other parts of the world, it's not defined as it is here. All right. Let's move on. Again, I need to move on. And sometimes I know you're trying to write all this down or type it all down, which I appreciate. But remember, it's all going to be recorded. You can go back and review whatever you don't get, so don't panic. Other developments. We see there is religious toleration proposed by the National Assembly. What does that mean at this point? It mainly means that Jews, there were some Jews in France, and there were Protestants. Because remember, France was a Roman Catholic country, state. And so if you weren't Roman Catholic, you didn't really fit. And often Protestants were persecuted. I mean, physically persecuted, even killed and driven out. Torture is banned. Women gain some new rights they didn't have previously. And I think at this point, many people believe France's problems were over. We had a new government. We had a constitutional monarchy. We had, new constitution. All right, let's live this out and see how it works. But guess what? This was not the end. In fact, this is just the beginning. Because once people gained some power, then they say, you know what, maybe we can get some more power. And there were some people who had a common enemy. The common enemy was, this absolute monarchy. Once that's gone, see, this is the thing about that rule I told you about earlier. My enemy's enemy is my friend. But guess what? What happens when you don't have that enemy anymore, that common enemy? Well, then you start to have problems between yourself. Like, say, the siblings who maybe turn on the one sibling, and then once the one sibling, isn't around or moves out, goes to college, now we start to fight with each other because we don't have the common enemy to keep us friendly. Well, this new assembly then begins to fight over how things ought to happen. Remember, we had a constitutional monarchy. Some people thought we need to get rid of the king altogether. What are we doing keeping a king? We don't want to keep a king. And so we see that the two factions, two main factions, divide in that National Assembly. One is called the Jacobins, and the other is called the Girondists. The Jacobins are the more radical of the two. The Jacobins think the revolution has not gone far enough. We still have a king, for example. We still have this sort of active and passive citizenship. We still have it so that voting is limited. By the way, ladies, they're only talking about men voting. Not all men can vote. And we should have universal suffrage or voting for men. And this faction is led by two people, Danton, the guy pictured here, and Robespierre. We'll see his picture later. The Girondists are more moderate. They support generally the idea of having a monarchy. They thought that France had come pretty far, and they didn't want, there had been a lot of killing, a lot of mob, going out. I mean, they're killing people in pretty gory ways, right? Because they're using shovels and hammers and picks and stuff. And they said, you know what? Maybe we need to just kind of take it easy here a little bit and just see. Let's have slower change now. Yeah, we can have some change. Well, let's do it slow. That's really sort of the definition between, I guess, in one way, you think about a liberal and a conservative, or a radical and a conservative. Both of them want to see change. Both of them don't want everything to stay exactly the same. However, a conservative would want that change to be slow, measured. More radical or sort of liberal left view would be, let's change it all quickly. Throw it all out. Okay? So, that's what you see here. And they export the revolution. By the way, we talk about left and right in politics. It comes from the French Revolution, from this National Assembly. If you sat on the left and the other sat on the right, you wanted less radical change than those on the left. And those terms, left and right, still are around today in our politics. Well, the Girondists are really gained control of the assembly, and the Girondists have an idea that one of the things that they can do to sort of keep power and to stabilize things is to actually export the revolution. They want to export the revolution. Okay? And so in exporting the revolution, they're going to do that by actually taking the principles of the French Revolution and export them to Austria, Prussia, etc. So to see the kind of upheaval that had happened in France, they really want to see that elsewhere. They say this is good for the people, this is good ultimately for France. So they tell the king, the assembly says, we're declaring war on Austria and Prussia. We're going to export our French ideas to Austria and Prussia. Now, if you're going to have this kind of policy, it actually can. Warfare can unify people. There's a few rules to it, though, if you're in power and you want to use conflict or war to kind of unify people. First of all, the war has to be quick. You can't let it drag on for years. Secondly, you got to win. You got to win. You got to win. You got to win fairly quickly. And of course, thirdly, you have to persuade the people. Maybe start off with this. Just persuade the people there's a necessity for this war. We need this war. We fight this war. We win this war. And we get it done, 18 months, 2 years. You don't want it to drag on. Well, here's the problem. A lot of people say, well, yeah, generally we think people ought to share in our French Revolution. All right. But the war, they don't win the war. So when they don't win the war, like a lot of things that happen in people's lives, when things don't go their way, what do? Do they say, you know what? Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I should change what I do. I need to take ownership of my problems and my mistakes. Is that what most people do? Sadly, no, they don't. What do? I heard somebody say it. Blame somebody else. That's exactly what a lot of people do. That's been happening since the Garden of Eden, by the way. That's nothing new, right? Well, our Lord, that woman that you gave me. She's the one that ate this. You know what he's really saying? God, it's your fault. You gave me that woman. That woman disobeyed. It's not my fault. Matter of fact, God, it's kind of your fault, if you really think about it. Everything was all right till you made that woman. I didn't make the woman. Right? That's the very first time of sort of shifting the blame to the woman and ultimately to God. And we do that a lot, right? We do that a lot. We like to blame God. Ultimately, we blame others, but a lot of times we're blaming God. It's not my fault. It's the government's fault. It's the administrator's fault. Professor's fault. My roommate's fault. I don't know, the list goes on. My parents' fault. It's not me. Well, anyway, that's what they do. They blame the king. You know what? The reason we lost this war is that the king wasn't really into it, The king was sort of against us. In fact, the king was treasonous. He probably told our enemies what we were going to do and when we were going to do it, and that's why we lost. Because after all, who is the king's in-laws? The Austrians. His wife is Austrian. She is the daughter of the royalty of Austria. The king, let's be honest, the king wanted out of France. I mean, he was basically under house arrest, and he did try to escape. So he did this. It's the king. And so guess what? They end up arresting the king in 1792. Because this idea is there. And by September of 1792, they're looking for other people to blame besides the king. You know what part of the problem is a lot of people here in France aren't really behind the government. A lot of people here in France aren't really behind the revolution. So guess what? We're going to arrest them. They oppose the revolution. They're not, with it. They're not with it 100%. So now suddenly I can turn in my neighbor. If I don't like what my neighbor does, maybe his dog barks all night. I've asked him, get your dog to be quiet. Maybe my neighbor annoys me in other ways, by what he does in his yard or by how noisy he is. Well, guess what? All I got to do is say my neighbor, I overheard my neighbor say he didn't really support the revolution. Guess what? My neighbor disappears. Problem solved. For me, right? That's the kind of stuff that happens. People start turning other people in. Saying, oh yeah, you should have heard him. He was always saying bad things about the revolution. He was always really supporting the king. You should have heard him. What he said about the National Assembly, I can't even repeat. Well, thousands are murdered and arrested for, theoretically anyway, opposing the revolution. And so the Girondists decide, you know what, we've got to change things up. And so they do. They form what is called the Convention. They disband the National Assembly. They form the Convention. They double down on their idea of exporting the war, and they renew the war. And they, in fact, abolish the monarchy September 21st, 1792. So we have no king. Spoiler alert, no king now as of 1792, September 21st. So what happens then is that the king is put on trial. He's no longer called the king. He's called Citizen Capet. That was his last name. He's a citizen, I guess, because he still had enough wealth. He owned some land. So he was a citizen of France. He's male, has land. But he's put on trial. And guess what? He's found guilty. Not really a surprise, is it? And in January of 1793, he is executed. He is executed by a device that had recently been invented by a guy by the name of Dr. Guillotine. Dr. Guillotine had invented his device as a way to be more humane in committing, in carrying out executions. Because, I think you know what the guillotine is, right? It's a huge blade, heavy blade, goes up on a track, you pull it up there with pulleys, and then you let it drop, you put the head through it in a little thing where you strap it in with wood. It's got a slot in it, and that blade comes down right through that slot. It's angled, cleanly slices off the head. Cleanly slices off the head. Now you might say, well, that sounds pretty bad, right? Well, the way they did it before is they had a guy hold your head down on a block of wood, and they'd take a big axe and have a guy chop it off. Sometimes it didn't happen on the first chop. Dr. Guillotine's device was so efficient that it was actually believed that you might still be conscious after your head is removed from your brain. Your brain's still up. Your head is removed from your body. You could actually, when your head spun around, you might actually see your body before you die. That's how fast it was. Well, think about that. Now you guys are thinking about video games. I know. You're thinking about all the possibilities. Now, you can't tell me that upsets you with all the video game stuff and all the movies and all the stuff you guys watch. People are dying in the opening credits. Well, anyway, you know what I'm saying? You can have 50 guys die before you even know what the title of the movie is. Well, anyway, yes, it's terrible, but that's what they did. And so the guillotine was invented by Dr. Guillotine to be a more humanitarian, more humane way to carry out executions. The Jacobins seized power because, the wars are not going well. And so now we have the more radical side in power. Under this guy's control, his name is Robespierre, the guy pictured here. France is ruled by committees. Robespierre is in charge of the most important of these committees. It's the Committee on Public Safety. Kind of ironic, right? Public safety. A lot of people died during this, what's called the Reign of Terror later on. Robespierre was an orator. He was a good speaker. He could convince people of sort of his point of view. They have these wars going on. What are they going to do? They introduce universal conscription. What does that mean? What is conscription? Universal conscription. Any ideas? We don't have this in the United States, by the way. Universal, I don't know. I don't think we've ever had universal. What is it? Well, yeah, it's kind of like the draft, right? But if it's universal, it's not a draft. Everybody's got to do it, yeah. Conscription means that you were brought into the military, being conscripted into, the army or whatever. Universal conscription means everybody's brought in. By the way, by everyone here, we only mean men. We don't mean women. Now, I imagine it's still the law of the land. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong. That once a male turns 18, you are required to register with a selective service. That's still going on? Right? Still going on, isn't it? Probably do it online now, right? You used to have to go to the post office. It's online. So online, you got to go and fill out your name, I guess, your address, probably your social security number, all that kind of stuff, right? And why do we have that selective service registration? Yeah, it's so we can have a draft. We want to know where all these guys are so we can call them up if we need them quickly. We don't have a draft, but we want to be ready right away if we need one. Because our military is all voluntary at this point, has been for several years. Now, I don't get very political, but this always gets to me a little bit. I always wonder about this. There's a lot of women who cry out about discrimination. I never hear any of them complaining about the discrimination that they don't have to register for selective service. Only males have to register for selective. Why not women who turn 18? It's not fair. It's discriminatory. Now, yeah, see? Well, don't worry. Nobody's going to bring it up. But I'm just saying there is I'm saying it, but of course I don't, there is a obvious discriminatory practice by the government that no one challenges. It's obviously discriminatory by gender. Only males and all males who are 18 have to do it. Women are not allowed to do it. Probably don't want to, but what I'm saying is, something to think about. I've never heard any candidate who is running for office bringing that up as one of their items that they would change. And if I'm elected, we will end this discrimination in the selective service process. Everyone will have to enroll at the age of 18. Yes, you're not going to get too many votes that way. So don't worry, ladies. I just bring it up, though, just as I don't know. I guess just because I can, and I think it's interesting, but that's what we're talking about. Universal conscription is everyone is in the military, but again, in France, it's only men. Okay? So, in one sense, it's not universal. So while women didn't get to vote, they also weren't in the military. We were not forced in the military at this point. So, I don't know if that's even or not, but that's what it is. And why did they do that? Well, we're going to throw a bunch of troops in to try to win this war. By the way, most of these troops did not know what they were doing, right? They weren't well trained. They didn't really even have the proper weapons. And they were sent off into this war, and many of them died because they didn't really know what they were doing. And if you were an opponent of the revolution under the reign of terror, you would be introduced to a device created by Dr. Guillotine, who earned the nickname the National Razor, because it would shave off your head. So I have a little animated thing of a guillotine here. By the way, this is where we get the saying. Have you ever heard the saying, heads are going to roll? It's exactly where it comes from. Heads are going to roll. Because when your head was sliced off here, it did roll. Well, I'm just trying to tell you where words came from. Well, and by the way, once they did this, once your head was sliced off, they had paraded you around ahead of time. The crowd, usually you were on a wagon with bars, and then everybody could see that it was you, right? And they would throw like rotten fruit at you, yell insults. Then they would take you up to the platform and they'd chop your head off. These were social events. These were public events. They would be selling food and stuff at these events. If it was today, they'd be selling corn dogs and elephant ears. And there were ladies out there in folding chairs, knitting and stuff. It's like a family outing. Hey, you want to go down and watch the executions? Come on, it'll be fun. And they'd go down, and that's what it's a big event. And then they would take the head of the person. By the way, they did normally put a basket or something down there to catch it. Then they would take the head of the person, and they'd put it on a pike like a spear, and they'd walk around the crowd so everybody could see the face of the person to show that we did not switch the person. The person we brought in here on the wagon is the person we cut their head off, and here's their head. Just in case you were thinking we did some kind of switcheroo. This is a big event. Well, they also got rid of Christianity. What? Yes. Christianity was abolished. Sundays were abolished. Instead of a 7-day-a-week calendar, there was a 10-day-a-week calendar. All the names of the months were changed. The great cathedral of Paris, Notre Dame Cathedral, its name was gone. You know what Notre Dame means, right? What does it mean? Anybody know? Know any Latin? Any French? Dame, lady, Notre Dame, Our Lady. This is named for Mary. Our Lady. This is Our Lady Cathedral. And the lady, of course, is Mary. We're going to get rid of that name. And it's going to be called a Temple to Reason. We're going to get rid of Sundays. Why do we have a 7-day week? It's because of the Bible. God created in 6 days, and He rested on the 7th. Sundays are abolished. The names of the months are abolished. We even change it to 10-day weeks, so it gets hard for you to figure out which day is which. You were probably named for a saint. We're going to get rid of all the saint names. We're not done yet. Got a couple more minutes. And I got a couple more slides. So let me do them. Well, at any rate, these were very radical things. Robespierre, many people thought had gone too far. He begins executing even his own guys in his own party, like Danton, who had spoken out against him. And finally, Robespierre is arrested. You see this painting here. This is called the Thermidorian reaction. Why is it called Thermidorian? That's what they named the month. Basically, it's like July and August. Thermidor, hot month. He gets shot in the neck during his arrest. Doesn't kill him, but it takes away his main weapon, which is his voice. He can't talk anymore. And he is convicted, put on trial, and he is executed by the same device by which he had so many others executed. He is taken out and guillotined on July 28th, 1794. July 28th is the 8th of Thermidor, by the way. And there's a new government that comes to power now that's called the Directory. So we've gone from the Assembly to the Convention to the Directory. Now I have one more screen. So let me put it up. You can go back and review. I know you're probably not going to be able to write all this down. We're going to talk about Napoleon next time. But this gives the opportunity for Napoleon to rise to power. Napoleon is brought in by the Directory to help crush a rebellion of peasants, which he does. And Napoleon will later overthrow the Directory in a bloodless coup. And he will come to power in 1799 and begin to establish power to himself. And we'll talk more about him on Thursday. All right, if you have concerns, send me emails and I will try to address them. Have a good day.